Welcome to the Hill Cultures YouTube channel. We will be presenting a series of webinars on the cultural history of the Eastern Himalayas in this channel. We begin our webinars with our first speaker, Ms. Shraddhanjali Tamang. Briefly about Shraddhanjali, she's a young academic hailing from Mirik in Darjeeling. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Film Studies in Jadavpur University and has recently submitted her thesis in the Comparative Literature Department of the same university on the oral aspect of the folk indigenous traditions from the Eastern Himalayas and particularly from the Darjeeling Hills. Shraddhanjali is also interested in the filmmaking practices in the Darjeeling and Sikkim Hills and is a principal investigator for Harusa project titled Filmmaking Practices in the Eastern Himalayas. She is also closely associated with the Center for Translation of Indian Literatures at Jadavpur University and has been working on translating Indian Nepali short stories, literary essays and folk forms such as Tamang, Madalai Geet and Lagari Savai. Shraddhanjali has worked on translations of Nepali short stories, which has been published in Call of the Hills, a collection of translated Indian Nepali short stories, and is also the co-editor of the book Tamang, annotated text and English translation, published by the Jadavpur University Press, Kolkata in 2015. Today, Shraddhanjali is going to talk to us about the aspect of orality and the interaction between the oral and the written in Tamba oral traditions. We welcome Shraddhanjali Tamang to our YouTube channel to make her presentation.
Welcome everyone. I will be presenting this lecture as part of the lecture series titled Retracing Cultural History, Tibetan Buddhist Art, Myths, Rituals, Oral Traditions in the Eastern Himalayas. I also like to thank the coordinators of this program, Professor Jayita Sen Gupta, Department of English, Kuch Bihar, Panchanan Burma University, and Dr. K.R. Ramamohan, Department of Anthropology, and Dean, School of Human Sciences, Sikkim University, for allowing me to be part of this program. The title of my lecture today is The Aspect of Orality and the Interaction between the Oral and the Written in Tamba Oral Traditions. And before I begin to speak about what is Tamba oral traditions, I would like to speak about the Himalayan region in brief and also locate this oral tradition. So the Himalayan mountain range, as we all know, runs as a continuous arc with the Indus in the west and Brahmaputra in the east. And then it has the Indo-Gangetic plains towards the south, and on its north is the Tibetan plateau. Now, horizontally, the Himalayas can be divided into three regions. The Greater Himalayas, which is the highest region. The second zone is the Inner Himalayas. The Inner Himalayas covered with forest, fertile valleys, many famous hill stations, and important centers such as Darjeeling, Shimla, Mussoorie, Kathmandu fall in this zone. The outermost and the lowest zone are the Sub-Himalayas, and it borders with plains of India. At the foothills in this zone lies the Terai and Duars. Now, longitudinally or in vertical sections too, Himalayas can be divided into three regions. The Western Himalayas has the Sub-Himalayas such as Kashmir, Ladakh. For Central Himalayas, we have Himachal, Garhwal, Kumaon, Nepal Himalayas. Now, the Eastern Himalayas, which is the focus of this lecture series, consists of Darjeeling, Sikkim, Bhutan, and Assam Himalayas. This lecture focuses on the oral tradition prevalent in Darjeeling and Sikkim region, and therefore will mainly focus in the Eastern Himalayas. It is also to be remembered that shared histories, cultures, and traditions is found across the Himalayan region, and therefore similar tradition may always exist in the nearby adjoining Himalayas. Similarly, though my research is based mostly in Darjeeling and in Sikkim, but similar traditions are also found in Nepal. At the same time, it is also interesting to note that the mountain terrain, the deep gorges and valleys, which makes it a difficult terrain to travel across, and in turn which has also allowed different regions to develop its own distinct unique traditions. Now we all know about the importance of Himalayas, but briefly talking about it, Himalayas with its biodiversity, with its geostrategic importance, diverse linguistic groups, cultures, religion and belief system, is globally recognized as a very vital area of study. The change in the climate, environment, ecology, livelihood and politics in the Himalayan region is intimately related to one another. And therefore Himalayan studies is also, I think, quite important to be interdisciplinary in its approach. Now the Darjeeling Himalayas in the eastern Himalayas has also been declared as a biodiversity hotspot. But along with being a biodiversity hotspot, it is also a cultural linguistic diversity hotspot with numerous languages, cultures, traditions, ethnicities, religion and belief systems thriving in this region. A quick reminder that Darjeeling region shares international borders with Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, and it is crucial that we remember that these international borders are modern constructs, and history, language, trade, culture have always been shared across these regions, which in turn provides its unique identity to the region. As we all know, Darjeeling was part of the Sikkim Kingdom, and in the mid-18th century, Nepal took over the region, and with the presence of growing British power, Darjeeling became part of British India in 1835. Now, much like the rest of South Asia, even with the demarcation of these modern political borders, a dynamic, active cultural exchange continues across these borders, which is reflected in its language, culture of this particular region. Speaking about this region, we can also speak about how Nepali acts as a lingua franca in the northern regions in Bengal and in Sikkim too, and is also spoken in several northeastern states. It is also spoken in Dehradun and outside India in Nepal, Bhutan, also in Burma. So across the Himalayan region, we have Nepali speaking population. Now, Nepali is a linguistic identity and is also a multi-ethnic identity that works like an umbrella term that includes various ethnic groups such as Newar, Limbu, Gurung, Tamang, Lepcha, who also have their own distinct language and also distinct identity. And among them, this particular lecture will speak about the Tamba tradition, which is indigenous to the Tamang community. Now, a short note about the Tamang community. Now, Tamang signifies both language and the ethnic community, and is one among many other ethnic groups that come together to make the larger Nepali identity. The Tamang language belongs to the Tibeto-Burman family, which is placed under the Bodic division, and originally does not have a script, but Nepali or Devanagari script and Tibetan Sambhota script have been used to write the language, though a modified Tibetan script has been devised and is in use in the current times. The use of Tamang language is also in decline, in India especially, and we keep hearing of many attempts of language classes and language promotions but not running successfully and closing down. But it would not be correct to say that not having a script of its own is the sole reason for its decline, but rather it's the combination of government not recognizing the language, the hegemony of quote-unquote larger languages in the region, and overall urbanization that has contributed to the decline. Now, speaking about the cultural markers of the Tamang community, the tradition of the Tamba. Now, Tamba would be an orator, a historian, a poet, master of ceremony of important social rituals such as marriage and death, a bonbo or a shaman or a healer, facilitator of pre-Buddhist Bon faith, a ganba who is an elder in the community, knowledgeable in Tamang language and culture. They all can be seen as tradition bearers of indigenous practices of the community. Along with them, Damfure singers who perform the Wai, that is the Tamang songs, and Tamang cello, which is similar to Tamang songs in tune and beat but is in Nepali, are some of the cultural markers of the community. Now, Tamang culture is primarily oral in nature, and all the above tradition that I mentioned, that of Tamba, Bonbo, Vai, have been traditionally oral in culture. And each of these traditions can be individually studied as oral tradition, but this lecture will specifically focus on the Tamba tradition. Now, in the word Tamba, Tam means speech and Ba is the agent of speech, and Tamba is known to be both poet and historian of the community. Now, it is to be remembered that our notions of what is poetry and what is history has been heavily influenced as a result of colonization and Western education. So here in these traditions, what is poetry could be history, and what is history could be poetry, and hence may challenge our notions of history and poetry. Tamba has a knowledge of origin stories, clan stories, history, and Wai or Tamang songs. He is a ritual specialist and acts as an orator in important social events such as marriage ceremony and death rituals. All these rituals and knowledge that he has is performed in Tamang language, and therefore it is prerequisite that a Tamba must know Tamang language. In my research, I have included all these knowledge of the Tamba that he puts to performance in oratory as the Tamba tradition. Now, when we speak of orality in traditions, I think plurality is something that becomes an important feature. The oral aspect of these traditions is seen in the multiple numbers of origin stories and clan stories. So there is not one particular origin stories, but several versions. Not one particular clan story, but there are several stories of the origin of clan. And likewise, even if we take the ethnonym, the Tamang, there are several versions of stories associated with the origin of the ethnonym Tamang. So some stories speak of Tamang word deriving from the word horse riders, some speak of horse traders, some even speak of ritualistic association to monstrous horse-like figures. But we also importantly see many stories that link the word Tamang with the word Tamba itself. And this claim also speaks of how Tamba is so integral to the Tamang language and culture and traditions that the development of these language and culture and tradition is intricately linked with the construction of one's identity, and therefore the word Tamba itself is related to the word Tamang. Now, speaking of the aspect of orality in the role of the Tamba, it is important that we remember that in today's time, it is quite difficult to have any culture which is purely oral in nature. In many instances, we as scholars may get into the trap of romanticizing indigenous and oral cultures. But we have to remember that today almost all oral cultures are influenced or are in contact with writing. At the same time, it is also to be remembered that writing too is not entirely isolated from orality. All written words only come alive when someone reads them, be it aloud or in mind. Only when the written words are read, the words call out and speak to the readers as a voice of characters, narrators, or author. In this way, all written words have somewhere sound in them, and therefore it would be problematic to simply divide between the oral and the written world as two very distinct and separate worlds. And while interviewing Tambas, they have spoken about referring to published materials or writing. But the performance and the characteristic of the narrative and the process of becoming a Tamba is what makes it oral in nature. So with this, my next point, I would want to talk about acquiring the tradition. So in terms of acquiring the tradition too, the Tamba learns his craft by following, observing the practices of another Tamba. So there are no courses or books specialized to train one. It is acquired status that the community gives him by accepting him in the role of a Tamba. Now, though this is still the process through which one is accepted, yet in the contemporary world, Tamba and those aspiring to be one do have access to writing and books. Now, in an interview with B.B. Sangdan, who is a very well-known Tamba in Mirik, he spoke about qualities required to become a Tamba. And he said that the person should know Tamang language, Tamang ritual, customs, should have some idea about religion, should be able to communicate with the audience, and have the ability to arrange, organize, and control situation during social events. Now, while the last two qualities, communicating with the audience and arranging the social event, this largely could depend on personality and maybe skills developed early on in life. But rest of the qualities about knowing the language and the culture and custom can be acquired from written and published works, along with gathering it from elderly, knowledgeable people, Ganba or other Tambas and Lamas, and other knowledgeable people from the community. Now, in the interview, B.B. Sangdan also spoke about his journey of becoming a Tamba. And his narration of how he became a Tamba did include contribution from written books, from community elders, from experience, which he finally put into practice of the oral ritual in a oral ritual narrative performance. Now, apart from B.B. Sangdan, I also spoke to Mangal Singh Gyabak, a very renowned Tamang cello and wise singer from Kurseong, who also spoke about his reference to the book Tamba Kaitan. Now, Tamba Kaitan was a book published in 1957 by Sandabir Lama, and it includes Tamang Wai, that is the Tamang songs and rituals and customs in both in Tamang and Nepali language, both printed in Devanagari. Now, in this book, Sandabir Lama himself acted as an ethnographer, and he collected songs and ritual traditions from across Himalayan region. And with this book, he converted the oral narratives and songs into transcribed written text in Devanagari. And Mangal Singh Gyabak in his interview informed that he had learned many songs from this book, though he had used the information by adapting and improvising according to suit his performance. Now, such instances speak about the transfer of the oral into the written text, but also the written text back into the oral form, making a full circle, therefore reminding us that there must always be exchange between spoken and the written world. Now, besides the process of learning the craft that makes this Tamba tradition an oral tradition, the Tamba tradition also does not have a particular referential fixed text or fixed author or a fixed teacher. The text is performed without acknowledging any definitive author, book, or even a teacher, but just the past, elders of the communities and ancestors are all remembered during the performance. Now, the oral narratives of the Tamba for the ritual performance during birth, wedding or death, and the numerous stories and songs are all inclined towards a more free narrative composition. One of the most significant roles of the Tamba is during the wedding, where the ritual of Choildam or Chardam is performed in Tamang language. The Kajenbar Wagdan is the main aspect of this ritual where the marriage is sealed. Now, during the Kajenba, the father of the bride declares the marriage and calls out to all deities, animals and birds and all people present, asking if they have heard the announcement of the union. It is important to understand that in this case, a Tamba becomes a voice for others who do not carry his knowledge. And since the father of the bride may not have the knowledge of the ritual or may not know the Tamang language, therefore the Tamba performs the Kajenba and speaks for the father of the bride. In such a case, he acts as the father of the bride, and such tradition also becomes personal recitals rather than simply ritualistic performances. Such personal quality further allows the orator to improvise, leading to changes in different situations. Improvisation further leads to multiple versions of the same narrative and thereby presents the important aspect of plurality in oral traditions that I have discussed before. Therefore, every Kajenma narrative may vary. Like some phrases such as stating the name of the clan, village of the bride and the groom, becomes absolute requisite. This is followed by calling out names of various gods and deities and animals and birds, asking them if they have heard the Declaration of the Union. Now, these names may vary in order, and some may be omitted while some may be added. There is no fixed written narrative for Kajenba, and only works on a faint outline that has been accepted as traditional. This entire declaration and speech is presented 3 times. And each time it ends with everyone present in the ritual responding with words Thaiji, which in Tamang means we have heard, we have heard. The ritual speech is the main wedding ritual, and it is the confirmation that everyone has heard these words. With the words being spoken and being heard, the declaration is sealed and completes the wedding ritual. Here again, the primacy and the authority of the spoken word is highlighted. Now, there are many books on Tamang rituals and traditions written by both Western scholars, Indian scholars, scholars from Nepal, also indigenous scholars within the community. But the Tamba, they do not use them as fixed referential text for their performance. Moreover, with the ritual being oral in nature, all these written published works depend on oral sources and may also vary from one another. Therefore, the information derived from both oral and written source is used as an accumulated information which the Tamba draws out and with various combinations of stock phrases and performs a spontaneous speech. Similarly, there are no fixed referential source text, be it in writing or oral, that the ritual narratives, songs and stories of the Tamba follow. Therefore, in Tamba tradition, it is not the relationship that the tradition bearer, here Tamba in this case, claims with the source text, because there is no fixed source text, but it is the acquired status of the Tamba that approves his narrative as traditional. It is the acceptance of the community, the acceptance of the narrative by the community that makes it traditional. The ritual of a Tamba being primarily oral in nature now exists among the Tamangs across the Himalayan region, but in some variations, but working within a faint conventional framework. Now, there is no standardized rules and narratives followed by Tamba, but in the recent times, I have heard of the need to standardize these ritual traditions being felt. Now, it would be interesting to see how such an attempt of standardizing impacts an otherwise non-organized, dynamic oral tradition. Now, working with oral narratives and oral traditions comes with its own set of challenges. While the fluidity of oral narratives has been celebrated by scholars of oral traditions and folk studies and folk traditions, it is the same feature of fluidity that has marked oral narratives as ambiguous and has been many times viewed with doubt and suspicion. Perhaps it is the very fundamental textual basis of our academic disciplines and research approach that makes such fluidity seem to be ambiguous. It is often said that the suspicion of an academic is also the same suspicion that a literate has. So where most of the time oral traditions are only valued when it reaches in a manuscript form. So in my research, I have tried to challenge such notions, and my research has been equally dependent on interviews, conversations, and performance, along with the written and published material. Concluding this lecture, I would like to say that understanding any aspect of the Himalayas provides a new perspective and a much more holistic understanding. So understanding any ecological, environmental, geographical, linguistic, cultural, or political aspect of the Himalayan region contributes towards understanding the Himalayas in a much more holistic manner. The oral aspect of the cultures, traditions, and literary expressions of the Himalayan regions, I feel yet have not received as much attention as it requires, especially the oral traditions of the Eastern Himalayas, and particularly Darjeeling and Sikkim hills have not received much focus, I think. There isn't a large collection of work focusing on these oral traditions, and very little has been archived as audio recordings. So it is important to draw attention to the orality present in the Eastern Himalayan cultures. And also perhaps we can also speak about the orality as an essential aspect of the larger Nepali folk literature and culture traditions. Further, these oral cultures and traditions have largely remained away from the literary or historical discourse of the Himalayan region. Further, there have been quite a few numbers of Nepal-centric anthropologic ethnographic works as compared to research focusing on Darjeeling. So, Darjeeling or Sikkim Himalayas. And it is also to be remembered that Darjeeling is a region where Nepali identity has become further layered with Indian Nepali identity. And Darjeeling has also been the center of Gorkhaland movement, because of which it also further very strongly adds the Gorkha identity to it. Therefore, shifting the study to Darjeeling region brings in new challenges, but also brings in new perspectives and becomes an important area of research. And understanding these oral traditions of any particular community, for this lecture I'm talking about the Tamang community, would not only help us understand the particular community better, but it also helps us understand the larger Nepali identity and also the Himalayan region in a much more holistic manner. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shraddha, for this lovely presentation. We will continue our discussion on this talk on the Teams Meet with those who have registered with us. And the discussion will also be available on the YouTube shortly. We thank one and all who have joined us for this particular program.